stereotypes of the Scottish economy can be quite frustrating when you speak to people, and that is not our economy.
Sometimes we be like, oh, well, it's just a stereotype. But actually, stories matter, right?
We have lots of strategies, action plans, nice launches, nice speeches, but actually, do we genuinely know what works?
Even if our economy grows, but it doesn't grow as fast as England's, our public finances are somehow diminished.
What really matters for Scotland in this kind of competition versus the rest of the UK, the way the budget's been set up, is high quality jobs, because they're the jobs that pay the tax revenues.
Right, folks, welcome back to Public Knowledge. In today's episode, we've got part 2 of my interview with Professor Graeme Roy, Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission and Professor of Economics at Glasgow University. We ask, what's the one area of rivalry between Scotland and England that we should actually be paying attention to? Are Scottish stereotypes holding our economy back? And is Westminster really to blame for all of Scotland's woes? Let's find out. The word growth has, got mixed meanings to different people. Some people think about economic growth and they think, oh gosh, that's linked to, natural degradation, destruction. And there is a sense that perhaps the concept of growth in Scotland has somehow become a bit of a dirty word. I mean, you might want to comment on that, but it'd be great if you give us a sense of why economic growth in the round, is important for us going forward, and why policies to produce growth, not at any cost, but policies to bring growth are really important.
Yes, I think it's one of these things where I think there's a lot of noise around a debate around growth, but actually it's a really subtle debate, and I think taking a view of either no growth is the only option or completely unrestricted growth is the only option. I think these two extremes, I don't think, certainly wouldn't be the majority view of economists. So there's a nuance in the middle, which is that I think that most economists would take the view, and I would certainly take the view, that actually you benefit from having economic growth, but that is done in a way which is also mindful of your environmental, your social, natural capital restrictions that you operate in there. And that starts to open up a much more informed conversation about saying, well, look, you can have economic growth from more volume or better quality. And once you start to think about, well, actually, it's about better quality, it's becoming more productive. It's not having more, but it's having a better quality healthcare system. It's about being able to shift from oil and gas into renewables. That's all still economic growth. That's all still, technological improvements that are going to improve our well-being over the long run, are going to enable us to support an ageing population. That's all growth, but it's framed in thinking about the outcomes you're trying to achieve rather than simply, well, it's growth for growth's sake. It's all about a technical measure of GDP, and I don't think most economists wouldn't think that that is ultimately the objective. It's ultimately about how do you create better outcomes. And it does matter for things like the public finances. So if you have economic growth, then that leads to higher tax revenues, which leads to more investment in public services. It leads to improvements in real wages, which leads to improvement in living standards. These are all things that in the round can help tackle some of your big challenges, whether that be inequalities, poverty, improved health outcomes. But it's all about the type of growth that you have rather than simply a mechanistic growth at all costs.
And could you just spell out for our listeners, when you say that you have more growth and therefore you'll have higher tax receipts going into the public purse, can you just unpack that for us? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's a really simple calculation. So essentially, most people in the UK are taxed on your earnings, and therefore if your earnings go up, then tax revenues go up. So as we earn more, then governments collect more tax revenues. So if we can actually grow our economy and we can improve our earnings, we can improve profits of companies, government get a share of that increase, which then means that they can invest more into public services. And again, if you take a step back and you look at over the very long term, we have better quality public services than we did 50 years ago. Healthcare outcomes are better. We have better quality housing than we did 50 years ago. We have more choice as consumers than we had 50 years ago. There are improvements in safety and vehicles, and everything we do has in most indicators has got better. And that's because over that time period, that long time period, you've had better economic growth. Of course, there are costs to that in terms of how that's then linked into climate change, and it's then about how you square all that circle back to make sure that the growth that you're getting is mindful of the environmental, social, and all the various other constraints you operate in, but also you're putting that growth to the right use to help sort or help to tackle some of these big challenges that you face, whether that be an ageing population or how do you get the technological advances in order to support the transition to net zero.
That's great. And so you've outlined there one of the ways in which growth helps improve the public finances. Now, if I'm correct, and I really want you to correct me in how I say this, so there's the second aspect of how our economic growth affects our public finances, which is unique to Scotland and the settlement that we have with the UK, which is that even if our economy grows, but it doesn't grow as fast as England's, then our public finances are affected and are somehow diminished by that. Can you pad that out, correct it, give it some nuance, please, because I'm not quite sure I've stated it correctly.
Yeah, so it's a very long story about how the Scottish budget is determined, but I'll try and give you a very quick whistle-stop tour through it, and we can maybe pick up anything that I don't do a good job explaining it. But essentially, the Scottish budget is a mixture of several different things. Two key elements are a block grant that we get from Westminster that is determined by the Barnett formula, and then, particularly the last few years, tax devolution. So following the independence referendum and then the Smith Commission, the Scottish Parliament started to get greater tax powers. Now, the way that this all interacts together is that essentially the Scottish Government get a block grant, and that gets adjusted for the fact that we now have these tax powers. How does it get adjusted? Well, each year an amount gets taken away from the Scottish budget, and that amount grows at the pace of tax revenues in England. And what we can obviously add in back in are the tax revenues that we now control in Scotland, and that grows at the rate of pace of growth that we have in Scotland. So if you put all of that together, what really matters is whether our budget is better off with tax devolution comes down to a really simple calculation, which is, are we able to grow our tax revenues in Scotland more quickly than tax revenues are growing in England? And that can happen for two reasons. It can happen because the government choose to increase tax rates, to change bands so that they're taxing us more, and then our tax revenues would naturally go up more quickly than they would do in England. Or it can go up because our economy is performing better than in England. And what we've seen since tax devolution is that the Scottish Government has been doing quite a bit of action on the first of these, so setting rates that are higher for some particularly higher earners than in the rest of the UK, and also freezing thresholds, so people are moving into higher tax bands earlier than the rest of the UK. So doing quite a lot of action to raise revenue, and that we think that will raise about £1.7 billion next year. But against that, since devolution, our kind of earnings base and our tax base hasn't been growing as quickly as the rest of the UK, and that's been eating in to some of that increase. So it's a mixed bag in the sense, from a public finance perspective, of greater action on tax rates and tax bands to raise revenue, but a weaker performance in the economy offsetting some of that.
And just so I'm clear, because I don't think I got it right in my head before, the second point that I raised about the economy, even if it grows and it's not growing as fast as England's, having an impact on our block grant, comes back down to the tax point again, does it?
Exactly,
or is it,
yes.
Is it, oh, it
Yeah,
does.
so
It's both from the tax perspective of us raising the tax in Scotland.
Exactly, yeah. So if our earnings are growing, then our tax base is growing. So that means that Scottish income tax revenues are increasing. So we're adding into the budget more tax revenues. But if UK earnings are growing even faster, their tax base will be growing even faster than ours, and that is acting to drag down the budget. And that's essentially what we've seen over the last few years. Our earnings have been going up, our tax base has been getting bigger, but it's just not kept pace with the rest of the UK.
And let's be honest, I mean, looking ahead, with the changes, the ageing population, a smaller working age population, I mean, what are the chances of our tax base actually growing? I mean, what does that rely on? What do we need to do to make sure that it does?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, without getting too technical into this, what really matters for Scotland in this kind of game or this kind of competition versus the rest of the UK, the way the budget's been set up, is high quality jobs, because they're the jobs that pay the tax revenues. So on the one hand, coming back to the very first point, all those strengths of the Scottish economy, the strong sectors that we have, the highly skilled workforce, the kind of high performance relative to the UK, other regions of the UK, that should stand us in good stead to have high earnings growth and positive growth in the tax base relative to the UK for the foreseeable future. Against that, though, there are challenges there. You mentioned the ageing population. A couple of other things which are kind of front of centre in our mind are things like the transition in the northeast and the effects of moving away from oil and gas into renewables. One of the reasons why Scotland has done really well over the last 30, 40 years is because you've had a highly productive, highly skilled, highly paid sector linked to oil and gas. Obviously, we're overweight in that sector in Scotland. We have many more jobs in that relative to the rest of the UK in relative terms. So as that sector, continues to enter its twilight years, then we have more of the risk of any decline in that sector relative to the rest of the UK, and that is quite a big risk for Scotland's public finances. You can see that from the numbers, and that kind of performance gap you spoke about, a lot of that is likely to be driven by performance of Aberdeen and the North East and losing that relative advantage. And the other risk that we have is that we talk about Scotland's economy and we talk about the rest of the UK. The rest of the UK has London and the South East. And so they have that key part of our economy that if that starts motoring, if the city starts doing really well, if bonuses start flowing in, back to that point about the calculation, it's not just how we do, it's how we do relative to the UK. And if London and the city and the South East take off, then we've got to run really quickly in order to catch up.
I mean, I'm just trying to think from someone listening to this, thinking, if that's calculated and all this is based on our performance relative to the UK, I mean, we're a bit doomed, possibly. I mean, someone might be thinking that in the sense of how would we ever compete with London and the South East?
So we've done it in the past. I mean, that's the thing is we have, as I mentioned, about if you look back in Scotland's history, where we were one of the weakest parts of the UK, but over a sustained number of decades, the growth of public services, supporting financial services, professional services, the energy sector, tourism, food and drink, high quality, we have actually, grown and caught up with the rest, because we have done it in the past. I think that's an important thing, I think, for us to bear in mind. But that, I think, just really highlights the importance of really effective policy making to drive the success of Scotland's economy. You may agree or disagree about the role of economic growth, but the point that we have in this framework for public services depends upon, at the margin, about Scotland's relative economic performance compared to the rest of the UK. So really effective policy making to create high quality jobs, to get investment, is important, not just for the economy, but also for public services too.
I mean, that's really fantastic to hear, and actually leads us on nicely to talk about the growth sectors that you mentioned. Now, in Glasgow alone, there are 3 sort of advanced manufacturing centres, national centres of excellence, and there seems to be quite a lot of nascent opportunities around. And what I find really interesting, the story I'm really interested in over the coming years, is as North Sea reserves decline. And just for the listeners, the changes in the North Sea and Aberdeen are not just because of net zero. It's that actually that region, that North Sea basin, the oil and gas basin, is a very mature basin. It's already in decline regardless of what environmental policies you have. But as we see that change, I'm interested in the story of what it means to, what the Scottish economy means, really. Because I think when maybe policymakers or, lots of people down south, when they look up to Scotland, even I've got friends who still talk to me like this, all they think of as the Scottish economy is essentially oil and gas and whiskey and salmon. And they just want to give people a sense of, the excitement that is bubbling away under the surface.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point about the stereotypes of the Scottish economy can be quite frustrating when you speak to people, and that is not our economy. It's not our economy in terms of where we employ people. It's not our economy in terms of where the investment side. It's not to say that these sectors are not important, but actually, if you look at simply in scale about what's going on in broader manufacturing, sustainable tourism, tech, financial services, professional services, the scale of our academic sector, these are where the real strengths of the Scottish economy are, along with these areas where people might have the stereotypes of Scotland's economy. So I think there's several things which I think are really fascinating. I think, we mentioned this about the history of Scotland's economy. To understand that our economy is like a constant, dynamic, changing element that just is evolving all the time. I mean, I mentioned, you look at, Glasgow and how Glasgow is evolving away from being, was the industrial heartland, but then it went into really quite significant decline and struggling to think about its economic future. I mean, if you look along the Clyde, so Glasgow, Inverclyde, West and Bartonshire, population of that area has declined by about 100,000 since the early 1980s. That population shifted east. So there's a big about what's happening to even just the basic geography of our economy is evolving all the time and moving from the west over to the east. But then you look at what's happening in Glasgow to reinvent itself, particularly in the innovation space, particularly in the tech element, particularly in the high tech and advanced manufacturing. You're developing quite a different type of economy that looks radically different from what it was 10 years ago, but also what it was 20, 30 years ago. And if you look at Aberdeen, again, already Aberdeen, yes, it's oil and gas capital, but starting to get ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about, what its future is in terms of a broader green agenda, a broader energy agenda, and the investment that's going into places like the Port of Aberdeen, the work of opportunity northeast, about diversifying into new sectors. I mean, it's all really quite exciting about where the economy is heading, but also in the rural economies as well. I mean, if you go back again in history, the view of the rural economy in Scotland was to get people out and to stop investment going in. That was a famous quote from Donald Mackay, who was the advisor to the Secretary of State for Scotland at the time. That was his solution to the Highland problem, was to get people out. And now you look at the Highlands and south of Scotland, and actually the solution is not about getting people out; it's getting people in for the huge investment opportunity that exists with renewables, the green economy, tourism. And how do you actually ensure you've got the infrastructure, the housing to cope with the demand and the opportunity that is coming in? So, I think not thinking the economy is something that ever stands still, but is constantly changing and constantly evolving. Some of it local, but coming back to your very first question, a lot of this is about global trends and how we can take advantage of that, and then understand where the opportunities are, and then investing in these as they emerge.
Yeah, and two things come to mind for me there. So the first thing about the stereotypes, and I think whilst that is, sometimes you'd be like, oh, well, it's just a stereotype and it's, the economy's different. But actually stories matter, right? Which is partly why I set up this podcast, because we're going to be deep diving into all parts of, Scottish economy, Scottish politics, history, etc. The story matters, because the story that we tell or that is told about us in places that have influence over whether, policies are changed to our benefit or disbenefit, so say down in Westminster, or to investors, global investors who do or don't want to invest. So just an encouragement for everyone to learn about this stuff and shout it from the rooftops, because this is how we change our own story and how we get this information out there. But the second part is that then it becomes even more crucial, doesn't it, that we are seeing that an excellent policy relationship between the two governments in Holyrood and in Westminster in order to be understanding and addressing and then investing in these areas to help us be dynamic and to grow. I mean, maybe you can't answer this, but how much faith do you have in that better working relationship?
I mean, I think it's one of the challenges that has been around in devolution for a long time. I mean, my sense, just again as a complete outsider looking at it, is that I think the last 6 months has been better than the previous few years. That's certainly the message you get from ministers, that is a much more constructive relationship that is existing between governments. The proof will come in action, and good words are fine, but actually how do you actually get decisions that are taken in a way where you can generally say, no, this is a strategic decision by the two governments working together collaboratively to take advantage of economic opportunity or to help solve a problem or to co-invest in something. The one challenge I would say as well, though, is that I would argue it's not just about effective policy making between the Scottish Government and the UK Government, but actually it's a question for us about, are we actually doing the most effective policy making within the levers that we control at the moment? It's a very cluttered landscape that we have in Scotland. We have lots of people involved in economic development. Back to your point about think tanks and understanding the economy, we don't have a big rigorous agenda about evaluation and finding out what works. We have lots of initiatives, we have lots of ideas, we have lots of strategies, action plans, nice launches, nice speeches about things. But actually, do we genuinely know what works? Are we genuinely investing in the right places? And are we being transparent about all of that? I mean, we've talked in the past, in some of the work I do, about sometimes style trumpeting substance. And I think there's a genuine question for us, if we hold a mirror up to ourselves in Scotland, about actually, can we do better, particularly in a world where we've got really tight resources, when some of these challenges that we face are really quite significant. Are we doing the best that we can do in order to deliver on the ambitions that the people of Scotland have? And I think there's a question for us about institutionally what more we can do there, and yes, what can be better done across different tiers of government.
And so on that point, actually, can you identify a few areas that we need to be focusing on to really unpick this?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at kind of big strategic policy questions, like economic development, the obvious question is, well, for the millions of pounds we're investing in this, what's the rate of return that we're getting? Are we getting good value for money? Is this the most effective way we can spend this money? What might happen if we spent this money in another aspect, in another way? And work that we did with Mary Spowage, who I know you've got on the podcast as well, we were looking at things like, the business rate system. Is it the most effective way to encourage business growth? And actually, it's very difficult, the way the policies have been designed and rolled out, and the data collected about whether or not they are. We just genuinely don't know. And they may well be the most effective policies we've ever done, but the fact that it's really difficult to assess that, I think, is a real challenge. And again, that's one of the areas where we perform much poorer than the best countries in the world about who do economic development in, whether that be in Scandinavia and similar places where they're really evidence-based about what they do. It's not to be critical of anything that's done before or anything we're doing at the moment, but it's just a really basic question of, could we spend this money slightly better? Are we spending it in the most effective way? And that can be done in business rates, it can be done in economic development, it can be done in, support for university, commercialisation of research, all those different areas. We don't have that culture of evaluation and scrutiny and holding our hand up and saying, okay, look, we've tried that. Maybe it didn't work as well as we could have done. Now we're going to try this. And I think that's something that we can definitely improve on.
And is that somewhere that the Scottish Fiscal Commission, the Audit Scotland, and, say Fraser Valander are equipped to do, or do you want to see some more institutional structures that can help in that?
I think this comes back to one of the questions we had earlier on about the quality of the debate that takes place. Because I think there's a limit that institutions can do, because I think it's important that you have quite clear lanes that you keep yourself into. But where is that vibrancy of a policy debate, not a political debate so much? I mean, political debates happen all the time, but a real vibrancy of policy debate about new ideas, looking at policies that we've done in the past, properly evaluating them and coming up with new vibrancies, ideas. And again, that comes back to the think tank community, it comes back to the academic community, it comes back to the wider public discourse and understanding on all of these issues. And I don't think that we have that vibrancy in Scotland that perhaps exists in Westminster. I'm not saying it's better, you get better outcomes there, but we don't have that same vibrancy of challenging ideas and people thinking big and proposing new elements, with notable exceptions. And I think that's certainly an area that could be improved.
Yeah, and just to the point of what you're saying, as you say, it's not because it's better, it's just, frankly, it's just very well funded. And I know that because I was one of the people that was funded to do this kind of thing down there. And, I've been back in Scotland for 4 years and just sort of been like, having chats here and there and really trying to prod this point. Okay, where could we get some money to set some of these sorts of think tanks up? And possibly getting somewhere with some places, but it's much harder. It's much harder to make the case for someone to, philanthropists to invest, for example, because that's where most of this money comes from is philanthropy, for example. So it is much harder, but it's definitely something that I think as well really needs to change for all our benefit, really.
Yeah, and there are some lessons of other places around the world that have been in similar situations and embraced it. So the classic example of this, the example that I think is the most effective of this is in Dublin, and there was something created called the ESRI, the Economic Social Research Institute, which was basically designed by the Irish kind of policymakers at the time of realising about actually you need to have a vibrant debate, you need to have evaluation, you need to have challenge, and they set up this institute, which is now going on to amazing things. But you look at the work that they do on the Irish economy, so many of the ideas about the Irish economy have come out of people who've worked in that institute and thought about these ideas. And even to this day, across different colours of government, are still held up as the gold standard of scrutiny, evaluation, asking difficult questions, proposing new ideas. So again, it's the importance of the wider fabric of the policy community beyond simply the policymakers themselves.
Well, listen, thank you so much. I've just got one final question for you, which is, out of everything we've talked about, or even if we've not talked about it, one thing would you say should be public knowledge?
You'd not be surprised that as chair of the Fiscal Commission, I think understanding the importance of the economy and how that feeds through to the budget is really important. And I think trying to improve levels of understanding about the Scottish budget process and why it's so important. £60 billion, £60,000 million going to be spent by the government on our behalf to help support outcomes and improve the economy. And I think people understanding that whole process, why decisions are being made, where these decisions are being made, that's the one area where I think it's really important that we have a much better understanding of.
Well, listen, you coming on this podcast and you appearing on all the panels that you do and you know, writing your columns in the Herald, etc., is one part of that, and we're definitely very grateful for your time and for all your work. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Public Knowledge. I hope you found it valuable, and there's plenty more where that came from. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts or Spotify, follow us on social media, and do have a think about which 3 people you know who would find this episode valuable and send it to them. Help us build a critical mass of people bringing public knowledge to light, because some things should never be kept in the dark. Till next time.